Hi, everybody, on this sunny Friday in New York. Hello. I'll give you a moment to connect to sound. Hello, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 1254th New Social Environment. I'm Chloe Stagaman, Director of Programs here at the Rail, and I have the extreme pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Allison Kemmerer, Gordon Wilkins, Sam Adams, and Barry Schwabsky. And now I'll introduce today's guests and host. Sam Adams is the Ellen Johnson Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art at the Allen Memorial Art Museum at Oberlin College. Adams previously worked at deCordova Sculpture Park and Museum, among other international museums. Addressing craft, race, and sexuality, their exhibitions include a series of projects with the textile artist Sonya Clark and the award-winning exhibition The Body, the Host, HIV/AIDS, and Christianity. As the Addison's Mary Strip and R. Crosby Kemper director, Allison Kemmerer provides creative vision for the museum, one that includes a commitment to presenting the diversity of the American narrative and the richness of the human experience through art. With over 30 years at the museum and a curatorial focus on photography and contemporary art, she has organized over 100 group and solo exhibitions. Gordon Wilkins is the Robert M. Walker Curator of American Art at the Addison Gallery of American Art at Phillips Academy. Wilkins oversees the care, exhibition, and growth of the Addison's world-renowned collection of American art across media, with a particular focus on the art of the 19th and 20th centuries. And our host today, art critic and poet Barry Schwabsky, writes for The Nation and is an editor for Art Forum. He's the author most recently of a collection of poetry, Water from Another Source, and he's an editor at large for the Brooklyn Rail. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Barry to get us started.
Thanks very much, Chloe. And thanks everyone for being here. It's really a pleasure. And it means a lot to me to be here to talk about June Leaf and her art. Uh, June is one of those artists who seems perpetually underappreciated. And those of us who do know and love her work can feel ambivalent when she gets more attention, as I hope she is starting to do now. We think people would get a lot from her work if only it were brought to their attention, but secretly, we like feeling like part of the special club of those who are in the know. The other day, I mentioned her to an art collector who said, I don't know her work. I only know the great portrait of her by Richard Avedon, which there it is in front of you. An amazing portrait. Last weekend, I attended a memorial to June where the speakers included artists, writers, filmmakers, and musicians. The artists included ones who are far better known than June herself is. Laurie Anderson, Joan Jonas, Kara Walker. It was amazing to realize how these remarkable artists, each one so special in her own very different way, all found inspiration in June. I first saw June's work 40 years ago. I hate to say that. 40 years ago at the Edward Thorp Gallery in 1985. I don't know why I didn't write about it until 10 years later when I reviewed her third show at the same gallery. Probably I'd felt from the start that although she was an artist after my own heart, someone who was an artist to her very fingertips, that it would take time to plumb this complex body of work, encompassing both painting and sculpture, and express at every scale from minute to grand. All of it, though, involves what that 1995 review of mine called an elemental feeling for the necessity of using the hand to give life to ductile matter. Later, I found an illuminating passage by the philosopher Gaston Bachelard, who spoke of images that stem directly from matter. And speaking of such images, he added, the eye assigns them names, but only the hand truly knows them. I think June's images are something like that. She was part of a generation of artists who came out of Chicago in the 1950s, but all of whom sooner or later ended up in New York, artists who were never tempted by abstraction, but held fast to the human image, however distorted or grotesque. The generation of Leon Golub, Nancy Sparrow, and the slightly younger Irving Petlin. Leon and Nancy, of course, were political in art and in life. Irving Petlin was very political in life, but not so much in his art. What about June? Her politics seem more tacit. Certainly, the politics of gender were at the forefront of her mind, but she wasn't someone who needed to make proclamations. She could express dark thoughts with humor and face the harms that humans inflict on each other with generosity of spirit. The current show at the Gray Art Museum, which came to us from the Addison Gallery of American Art, is the largest display of June's work I've had a chance to see, and noteworthy for including many early works I'd never seen in person before. It's organized thematically rather than chronologically, and since we have the show's curators here with us, I'll ask them to talk us through the themes they've uncovered. I don't know which of you wants to start.
I can start just with a little bit. Barry, I completely agree with that sentiment of wanting to hold tight the secret of June, but at the same time, share her with the world. And I have to say, again and again, while the show was up at the Addison, and I assume the same will happen at Gray and Oberlin, who co-organized the show, people have come up to us and said, why have I never heard of this woman? So it's really important for us, secret be damned, that people out there are learning more about her work. And that is one of our overarching goals for the show. And I'll let my two co-curators jump in, but I will say that this is the most comprehensive show of her work to date. Before that, it would have been Philip Brookman's show for Washington Project for the Arts, which coincidentally came to the Addison in 1992. So for the Addison, it's a bit of a full circle in revisiting old friends, but adding in work that was created since then and along the way. And I actually, like you, having met June 40 years ago, I was at the Addison 33 years ago when that show was up. So it's been especially rewarding to sort of revisit all of this and amplify it with two brilliant curators, Sam Adams and Gordon Wilkins. And I'll just start by saying we got to work with June for a few years in the process of this show, which was incredibly, it was an honor and a privilege, and it breaks our heart that she isn't here to see the show in its fruition, but it's comforting to know that she knew it was happening. We dove into the studio with Andrea Glimsher and Carrie Asenzo, pouring through hundreds and hundreds of objects, trying to figure out how we would capture June's spirit, her trajectory, and make some sense of it. And that's how we came pretty quickly to the idea that we would organize it thematically rather than chronologically, because June, in a circuitous way, returned to themes, no matter how her work evolved or changed, returned to themes repeatedly throughout her career. So we came up with 5 themes, which we gave titles to, and the titles are drawn from June's words herself. The 5 themes are street dreams, to create life out of life, climbing still, the prophecy of her power, and the 2 sensibilities walk linked. And we can walk you through and explain those. I'd also want to say, while we wrote section texts, all of the object labels are June's words. She is incredibly poetic. The words are drawn from journals, letters. Her letters are works of art in their own right. But we felt it was very important for her voice to be paramount in the show.
Just to interrupt with a question, is there any plan perhaps to publish her journals or her letters or other writings?
Well, it's funny that you mention it. So there is a really wonderful facsimile that Steidl did of a journal that June kept in the mid '70s, which documented this very tumultuous time in her life as she was settling into Canada, but then simultaneously Robert Frank, her husband, Robert Frank's daughter, perished very tragically in a plane crash. So it's her navigating those emotions. It's a beautiful facsimile, and they have plans to publish another facsimile of a notebook that June kept when she was in Japan. So there's so much more to be done. We also, we feel like we've provided this very comprehensive, more or less overview, but we still feel like we're kind of scratching the surface. There's so much more to uncover on when it comes to June Leaf, and I think hopefully, even though we may not want the world to know about June, hopefully this will spark continued interest and inspire future generations to take up the mantle and continue to delve into June's really remarkable career and life. I won't rant for too long, but this first section, this what you're looking at now, Woman Theater, this is a key work that we borrowed from the Smithsonian American Art Museum. It has never been on display at the Smithsonian. It's been in their collection since the 1970s. So we're really excited to bring a lot of these works out of deep, deep storage. Ascension of Pig Lady, which was a major piece that June exhibited first in New York at a show at Alan Frumkin, her debut New York show at around the age of 40. This amazing piece has been on view at the the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, but not since the 80s. And the last time that it was on view before this latest exhibition was actually at the Addison in 1991, 92. So we are really excited to be able to through this exhibition, and as you mentioned, Barry, just introduce people who may think they know June's work to the very early work. So we cover about 75 years of artistic production from the late 40s up until 2023. And she was truly working up until the very end of her life. So it's a remarkable 75 years of just unstoppable, unflappable creative production, which is, I think, staggering, particularly for artists to think of maintaining a studio practice of that intensity for 75 years is just staggering.
I'll say a few things about this first section of the exhibition, which we titled Street Dreams, which the exhibition that Gordon just alluded to, that was the title of it at Alan Frumkin Gallery in 1968. And so the 5 sections of the exhibition honor these affects and gestures and ideas that June Leaf returned to cyclically over and over again. This first section, Street Dreams, kind of feels to me like the exception, because for the most part, it actually is a little bit earlier chronologically than the other works, and it really visually nods to her origins in Chicago. So she was early on really compared to Red Grooms. She was coming out of this moment of the monster roster and the Chicago Imagists. So there is something carnivalesque and cartoonish about these works, which at least to me, I don't know, Gordon and Ali, if you would agree, is a contrast to the more spindly kind of maybe angsty works that we see later.
Definitely.
Yeah. And so performance is this kind of like keynote throughout, but here, like Ali kept referring to this section as we set the stage. We wanted this to be the first thing that viewers walk into because June actually literally refers to stages in so many of these pieces, circus stages, ballrooms with dancers, kind of rotating stages, the kind of balustrades that you see at like the Metropolitan Opera House. And so, yeah, there's something both chronologically in terms of color and form, which to me is very different in this work from the late 60s to the early 70s.
And I think in this section too, biography plays a huge part. So it's the art milieu in Chicago that she's part of or experiencing, but it's also childhood and her growing up in Chicago, loving the Navy Pier and the carnivals and the memories of that, and growing up with her family, the spectacle of life as a young child, and sort of from the very beginning embracing the good, the bad, and the ugly, and being thrilled by all of it.
And she just had this wrapped sort of joy when it came to just perceiving the world. She was this, from a very young age, this sort of flanneuse in training. She would go off with her, in the 30s and 40s, this little girl with, the Buster Brown hat going on the Chicago Elevated by herself to dance lessons. She was born into a Jewish family in the north side of Chicago, and her family actually operated a tavern, which plays, a major role in a lot of the characters that would come to sort of dominate June's life and creative practice, where she was just this keen observer, almost like this, like the transparent eyeball, like the Emersonian transparent eyeball, just going out and taking everything in. So, as Ali mentioned, there are these amazing stories of her talking about riding between the train cars on the elevated and peering into the windows and the gold lettering on the shop windows and seeing all of the merchandise high above in the department stores. And she would go to joke shops, and she would go to Navy Pier, as Ali mentioned. She would play with claw machines. She loved the thrill of putting a nickel into a claw machine and then getting something. And she started to, again, develop this real fascination with mechanical devices from a very young age. But she loved all of it, the horror and the thrill that go simultaneously. And Chicago in the 30s retained some of its frontier kind of honky tonk quality. So there was plenty of, I can't imagine the types of things that she encountered as a young child in Chicago. But then just finally, if we go back to Ascension of Pig Lady, June talks so much about these characters that really occupied her, and she thought about that in a very, and she was not necessarily speaking in a metaphorical sense. She, I think, truly felt the weight of these characters inhabiting her, and the only way for her to process, and this is across the board, was to make and to take things in, absorb them, and then sort of cast them away by creating. And so she talks about this kind of exorcism of these characters, and you see in the Ascension of Pig Lady, this woman with the blonde hair, this kind of blonde bob who's being lifted into heaven. And this figure is derived, and when you actually look at her, you can see why. She's derived from a woman that June used to observe at her parents' liquor store and tavern, who would sit on a stool and urinate down the stool. And so this is the kind of place, this was not a high-end establishment. It was the place with wood shavings on the floor. There were newspapers on the tables. And so she just could not, as I imagine if I saw that at, 7, I wouldn't be able to get rid of that image. But then she was, 30 years later on the bus in New York, and she looked out and looked into a restaurant window and saw this waitress who reminded her so much of the woman from Chicago from 30 years before. And so it was 1968. There was a lot of turmoil in the country. It was right after the Democratic Convention in Chicago. And she thought, it's 1968, maybe God is going to come back in the form of a waitress. And so this is a waitress being lifted into heaven. She's transforming at the same time into a pig. So it's the Ascension of Pig Lady. And there are these sort of autobiographical characters. June is represented typically by this young girl, kind of really excited, often with a hoop and the Buster Brown hat, ready to go out into the universe. Her father and mother accompanying her. And it's this great New York backdrop. And then you have this character off into the side who's spitting, this kind of leering figure with what's often referred to as a ketchup gun. But again, speaking of the kind of violence that's lurking at the surface, or, just beneath the surface. So these, deeply, profoundly autobiographical works. And it was part of her process. She had to make work in order to process it and move beyond it. And so those characters, this cast of characters from her childhood never really left her. And these works were her attempt to sort of process these memories, these very vivid memories from her childhood.
It's so interesting that you bring up how deeply embedded childhood was within the imagery of this early work, because later, so much of her work seems to take the form of a kind of toy, and so it's not so much the imagery as actually the viewer's kind of bodily relationship to the thing that becomes reminiscent of childhood.
And she talks a lot about her childhood toys. I mean, that is part of what she does is she's attracted to something and she needs to take it apart to figure out how it works. And so, throughout, she talks about these epiphanies that occur to her throughout her life. And one is having this favorite little lawnmower toy that she adored. But the only way to really, honor that love was to throw it out of a third floor window and have it break apart so she could see what made it work. And the intent was the next morning to go down, put it back together and figure it all out. But by then it had been taken away. But she's constantly taking what appeals to her and dissecting it and then reconstructing it.
If I can say something on that, like both the installation that we just looked at, the Ascension of Pig Lady, which looks kind of like a stage set, and the reference to toys, there are so many scrolls that are hand wound. I think for me, it was really a challenge to resist trying to slot June Leaf into existing art histories. So when I look at this stage set from 1968, and I start to think about like Edward Kienholz and Alan Capro and Alison Knowles and these artists who are really engaging with theatricality in this way, I had to remind myself that June was not doing exactly what they were doing. She was interested in performance in this very tangential, roundabout way, but she was not actually making happenings. And then with the kind of handheld pieces and toys, I kept thinking about kinetic art and fluxus artists and this art that was meant to be activated and engaged as a fundamental part of its significance. And one of the first questions that I asked when we met with June in her studio is like, are these kinetic works? Like, can we somehow activate them so that people see that they're meant to be used? And she was like, no, they'll break. And but yet she activated them all the time. She was playing with them. She was engaging with them. And so that's kind of an interesting challenge to an artist whose work some of those works are just now being collected by institutions, is how will institutions honor that aspect of play and engagement, which was a little bit different than kinetic art that was being made at the time.
Although I think I remember, I guess it was at that memorial that I mentioned, there was a film, or maybe it was at the show, I can't remember now. There was a film that was screened, very brief, where she has a piece that's made
That
with a
was
very tall jack.
the two women on a jack.
Yeah, and it was so funny to see her just like pull the lever and make this thing go. And of course, it's a big, heavy thing. It doesn't look very breakable at all. It'd break you before you could break it, unlike the other little kind of hand-sized pieces.
Yeah. She was really a born performer, and she started taking dance lessons as a young girl in Chicago. And then there's this, as one of these sort of strange twists of fate, when she was a teenager, she developed asthma, and she was sent, as many young girls were, were sent to Arizona to recuperate. And she has this very vivid memory of attending a performance by Agnia Enters, who was a dance mime who was able to embody dozens of characters on stage while painting simultaneously. So she would switch between these characters. And the sort of twist of fate is that Agnia Enters performed multiple times here at Phillips Academy. And we actually have two works by Agnia Enters in our collection. So we were able, our colleague Rachel Vogel curated a show drawn from our permanent collection in response to June Leaf. We were able to bring those in. And once you start thinking about these influences, people like Agnia Enters is kind of artists whose creativity was, who performed creativity in such a fascinating way that totally enraptured June. You really understand how important, storytelling, performance, the way that she carried herself, the way that she interacted with her objects. The video that was alluded to with two women on a jack, which is the piece that you see here, there was a great recording that Joan Jonas, who is a dear friend of June's for many years, made of June kind of slyly looking at the camera, smiling, kind of flipping, touching the little jack component, then walking away kind of sheepishly, then coming back and smiling. And you see this, the noise of the the ratcheting Jack on Bleecker Street and all these passerbys wondering what's going on. She loved to be out in the world. She loved to perform, and she was really, really gifted as a performer.
Now we've kind of jumped order. Should we?
Yeah, maybe
go
we have
to
to
the
go back
next
to our
section?
tour through the show.
So yeah, Street Dreams set the stage. Another section, which in the gray is the next section, to create life out of life. This idea that June was creating work that about breathing life into something, setting something in motion, pulling it into existence. So we have Zephyr with his life-giving breath. We have this, actually, looking at this slide, I'll switch gears a little bit. This sort of coincides with June's move with Robert Frank from New York to Mabu also. That was in 1970. She talks about coming home one night after walking through the city and absorbing stimulation and the thrills and the kaleidoscopic energy of the city, coming home and Robert saying, I'm sending you to Nova Scotia and you're going to find us a house. And she talks about being crestfallen, not wanting to do it, but wanting to be wherever Robert was. So taking that challenge and doing it. She goes out, she finds them a house, and she sort of ups the ante by saying, not only are we going, but we're going to be full-time residents, not part-time. So she talks about this move as being the greatest adventure of her life, and the two of them in middle age starting all over. But when she gets there, she's a bit paralyzed. She's undone by the shift from the loud, noisy, lively city to a very still, hushed, sparse environment, and she's paralyzed. She doesn't know what to do. There's a period of time where she is not really, she feels rootless and ungrounded. And so she writes in her journal about, it's become clear I have to provide the stimulation and I have to direct it. So she sort of draws herself out of this paralysis by just cataloging everything she sees. So she's looking in, looking out, drawing things like garden hoses, lawn chairs, all the people around her, trying to get a sense of her new surroundings and find her bearings. And she does. And that imagery starts turning to sort of looking micro with all these, or macro, everything around her, to micro. She also buys a couple microscopes. She studies microbiology textbooks and starts looking at minutia, and talks about another epiphany where she's looking at cells jostling against each other. And she says, oh my God, it's the Chicago Loop. I see them. They're jostling, they're fighting, they're shitting on each other. That is the shared affinity between city and nature. It's just the business of life, of us jostling and trying to find our way and slogging through. So a lot of the imagery in this section, a long-winded intro to this, you'll see microscopes. You'll see figures with microscope heads. You'll see eyes. You'll see objects and cataloging of her new surroundings and her pulling herself out. You'll also see ambivalence. There's one work on paper, How Can I Be Sure? I think is coming up. Yes, where she's in the Mabu studio looking out at what seems at first to be a very hostile environment, but they're both on the precipice of merging. And I think this is one of my favorite works of her, just at that moment of sort of feeling a bit at sea, but also the moment before she finds her bearings and these two worlds merge and she finds her way and continues on.
And this is also a really interesting work. I think the next show, hopefully someday, there will be a show that really looks at Robert Frank and June Leaf together. I think for so many years in this, it's a very complicated dynamic at play of, when you have someone who is of this kind of mega fame that Robert Frank was, and someone who is in more or less the same industry, living in or that many would perceive as living in a shadow of someone else. That's not how June saw it. She was very comfortable. She would say, "What's so bad about being waiting in the wings, or sort of being in the shadow?" Because she, her relationship with Robert was of paramount importance, and I think having him take all of the kind of public attention and the pressure that came with that allowed for her to make work and kind of occupy a space outside of the art world, so to speak. But you start to see, these hints at collaborative work. You see photographs emerging. Robert, by this time in the 70s, had really sworn off photography and was considering himself more of a filmmaker than anything. And she started picking up a Lure camera and started to do her own photographs. And I think that in a way kind of drew him back into still photography. So you do see in a lot of these works as well, you do see his literal presence and then his figurative presence kind of can be felt throughout. So we wanted in this show, because June is not as of yet the household name that Robert Frank is, and the term Robert Frank has so much so charged. We wanted June to sort of exist on her own and her own footing with this show. But I hope that someday someone will go really deep to look at the ways in which they informed each other's work, which they would say that they didn't, or that they worked in parallel lanes. But there is so much of June and Robert's work and so much of Robert and June's work. So that's something for the future, we hope, or I hope one day.
Although I just add that in the recent MoMA retrospective of Robert,
yes,
June was very, very
present,
acknowledged as a kind of presence in his work and life, and as a kind of collaborator, I suppose.
Yeah. But I think there's even more than what was revealed at MoMA, which was wonderful to see that entire wall of work by June. But I do think there's even more to uncover.
So to add to what Ali was saying about June's and the relocation to Mabu, Gordon and I went to Mabu for June's celebration of life over this past summer, one year after her death, organized by Hyphen Art Advisory and the estate of June Leaf. And it was very special to be in this landscape in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, which appears in a number of her drawings and paintings. And also to meet her community. Like more than 200 people came out in this tiny remote fishing village, which also like Joan Jonas was there. And but for the most part, they were not people with art backgrounds or part of visual art communities. They were like fisher people and agricultural workers. And to hear kind of 5-year-old, 10-year-old kids say, "Oh yeah, I remember Miss June always working. She was always working." And some of the works that you see in this section are very diagrammatic, or there's kind of storyboarding or diagrams. And so you start to see how June set out problems very, like she was very, interested in philosophical problems, but often they were very logistical problems. Like, how do I get this sheet of metal to bend in this way? And she would just go around like asking anyone. And so people were like, "Oh yeah, like I mowed their lawn," but I would come into her forge and help her figure out how to make this piece of metal do this thing. And so we start to see some of that impacting the works in this section.
It is the most spectacular landscape. I think, I'm from, or my family's from Maine, so I think I know that I know Nova Scotia is still not Maine, but that general part of the world, you think or you can anticipate what the geography might be like. But when you get there, it is the most spectacular sort of otherworldly landscape of this just piercing green that meets the blue ocean. And you see that so much in her work, that color palette, the green and blue. You see so many elements of Mabu, and you see even here that the painting of the big head right behind the sculpture of the big head is partially inspired by her glimpsing some sort of buoy in the water as she's taking a ferry, and the reflection of the buoy with the Mabu landscape in the background. So Mabu is a really key location, a key place, and you start with Mabu. I think also, as Ali was mentioning, you go from the sort of really almost hermetic, really self-referential work of the beginning to this work that is more what perhaps she's known for, the spindly work that has a more universal quality. Even though, of course, her early work, it's interesting because again, she returns to these themes. Her some of her very earliest work is engaging with archetypal kind of Venus of Willendorf type figures, these sort of universal female forms. So she does again this kind of from the general to the particular to the general to the expansive, this constantly in flux. But the importance of Mabu and the people of Mabu really cannot be overemphasized at all. I mean, this was a community, truly a community for them. June and Robert did not want to be summer people. June, in particular, saw what it was like in the Hamptons one summer as a visiting artist, and she did not want to repeat that. And it's something that I really personally appreciate, as you know, in Maine, and there's this whole dynamic at play as there is there of summer people and year-round people, and they did not want to be part of that. And so they, you know, for the beginning of their time in Canada, were there year-round, including the very desolate winters. But they forged the most incredible community there. They were very quiet about the philanthropic work that they did. A lot of that was kind of revealed at this memorial service, but it just, you know, that they were real people and truly connected and added so much excitement, I think, to this world, where, you know, Robert taught photography classes in Nova Scotia. June was, you know, would serve ice cream to the local kids and go swimming. I mean, it's this very, very sweet relationship and a very earnest relationship that
Do
they
you
share.
know anything about the kind of backstory of how it is that there was this sort of influx of New York artists to Nova Scotia circa 1970? I mean, not only uh, June and Robert, but Joan Jonas, Richard Serra, Phil
Sarah, yep.
Yeah.
Glass, Bob Moskowitz, maybe it was a little bit later, and others. What do you have any sense of how that all was triggered?
I don't know. And it's interesting because it sounds like June and Robert, except for Joan Jonas, and even then, not regularly, did not hang out with the other artists
Yeah.
there. They really were part of the community. But that's a really interesting question. I'd like
There
to
was
know.
something, I don't know what was in the air, but it is this really interesting moment. But geographically, you know, Jonas talks about walking the 5 miles over the mountain to go see June. They sort of, June and Robert lived in a very distinct area that is sort of separate from the rest of
Yeah,
the
absolutely.
New York crowd. So even though they would have been very familiar with them, I think they probably thought they saw all of those people enough in New York. So they had their own life. They were, you know, June, there were all these people, you know, June was sort of the center of gravity. People came to her. And I think she wasn't really necessarily interested in the, you know, maintaining this kind of pseudo New York social life in Canada. This really this is a really key work that we were fortunate enough to have in the show. The mooring, you start to see a little bit, there are some images of this kind of distended pregnant head in work that predates the mooring, but this is really the first really explicit engagement with this shape, and you then see it repeated in multiple works across the exhibition and in different media, because she had such a facility of translating ideas across media. But the big sculpture, which we were so pleased to get, the big head, was actually fabricated by Lippincott in Connecticut. They invited June to do whatever she wanted, and she said, really, I can do whatever. And they said, yes, whatever. And I think she maybe tested their patience, because at one point it was going to be she wanted to do a fully formed kind of automaton that could walk on a treadmill and would project an image of the Last Supper or the crucifixion from its eyeballs. She had, you know, she was always running up against what was humanly possible. And she would find ways to work around that. But, you know, there was only so far she could go with this. But that piece, the big metal, patinated, multicolored head, does turn. There's a bellows, and the tongue kind of flits in and out, and there are gears in the head that spin. It breathes. And this was a really exciting sort of rediscovery because for years it was in a lobby at the University of Chicago Law School. And I can imagine it's, there's a handle. I'm sure it was used and abused at the University of Chicago. Then it fell into private hands. And we were really, really happy to bring this out. It hasn't been shown in quite a few years, but this was the result of her ongoing kind of the climax of her engagement with this distended pregnant head, pregnant with possibility, pregnant with creativity, this really interesting form that became one of her signature motifs.
But
Yeah, I mean, when you
also, oh,
go
sorry,
ahead.
go ahead.
No,
I
you.
was just going to say it's also, she talks about this being her response to, and Sam, you could elaborate on this, but many invitations from other artists to contribute to feminist group exhibitions. And she felt sort of that I live that. I don't need to join in on a focused response to that. But then thought, okay, what if we built a monument so big of a woman, so big that people from outer space could see it? That would be the ultimate, sort of reflection.
That would shut the men up for good.
Yeah, that would shut the men up and show feminine power.
So we did skip over one section, which we'll return to, called Climbing Still. But right now we're in one gallery of the exhibition full of feminine archetypes. And so we've seen some of them. There's these kind of like bulbous fertility figures that there's like these cycladic women with their hands raised. There's the angels. There's this kind of woman monument that Gordon and Ali just described. And so I'm kind of hesitating saying that it's about gender because that was one of my first questions. I was really thinking about like Niki de Saint Phalle and Louise Bourgeois and how June Leaf kind of might have shared some similar experiences as those artists. And she said something which I absolutely loved, especially because I'm coming from Oberlin, where the kind of culture on campus is that the students are like so post-gender, like they're genderless avatars completely divorced from their bodies. Which is like, I want to be in that future with them, but we're not there yet in so many ways. And so I just was like, well, for this exhibition to land at Oberlin, I kind of want to know a little bit more about how June Leaf thinks about gender. And I asked, and she said, wait, Gordon Ali, is this what she said? There is no gender. There is no such thing as gender.
Yeah, that's what she said. Right.
And, there's like, of course, this is at a very late moment in her life, and she's thinking back, and she's kind of, there are a number of recent exhibitions of women artists, overlooked women artists that June was included in. And I love that gesture in a way to kind of bring visibility to something that had been obscured. But I also do think that these feminine archetypes operate outside of gender and outside of binary gender. And it was very gratifying for me to hear that was true for June also, that these are kind of archetypes. And in the sense that like women or women identifying or women passing people are constantly engaged in struggles of all sorts for power, struggles with opposing forces. I think that's more the tone of these works.
But wouldn't you also agree that, like you mentioned, Niki de Saint Phalle and Louise Bourgeois? I don't know Niki de Saint Phalle's work as well, but with Louise Bourgeois, there's always the sense that she wants to put a kind of autobiographical narrative on the image, and like the spider is the mother, and that's the father, and so on and so forth. And I don't think that, even though we can see echoes of their work, like especially in the early work of June, where it's the woman theater and the woman machine, and you can compare that to, in the same period, Louise Bourgeois with the woman house and so on. I don't see these as I don't see these as avatars of herself. I see these as actually more related to her observation of the world out there, just like you showed us in the first section on the street dreams, where she's actually observing this crazy reality that we're in, and who are these people, and what are they, and what are they doing?
I think that's right. And at one point, she says, "The secret is it's not about me, it's about us."
Exactly. Yeah.
And so it is her observing, and some of these are certainly not autobiographical. It's interesting to me also that they have these, some have very typical, kind of like stereotypical, kind of Barbie-like figures, and like they're wearing high heels. They have like perky breasts with some of them. It's like she's gone to extra effort to like accentuate like their pointy nipples and like this like blown out hair. And so she's really playing into hyper femininity in a way. I mean that well, so again, I'm trying to resist putting her into art history, but that other kind of proto-feminist pop artists were also doing Dorothy Iannone, others were doing it at the same time. But like yeah, we see they're also mechanical. They also have like cranks and gears, and so they're not like necessarily like they're not like baby producing bodies. They're producing something kind of I don't know, something very modern. So my favorite drawing in that section is a kind of a rubbing that she did of a woman in high heels, and she's like profiled, and she's this tiny waist and these like perky breasts. And June writes below it, her heart turns in chest like a distributor, and her hips contain the dinosaur bone crankshaft, woman
Huh.
of the 20th century. And so she's just spanning thousands of years. And it's this very like now passe idea that there's something universal about gestures and bodies and bodily experiences. But that was very important at that time to address.
And I think her description, it goes back to Barry, you saying it's what she's seeing. She talks about the woman machine and about observations coming through the eyes, going into that swollen head, stewing, percolating, coalescing, traveling through the distributor heart, and then out through the hands, back into the world. And that circuit system just repeatedly operates over and over with everything she's soaking in.
But I also do think, there's also another quote where she talks about all of her work is really about her love of the women in her life. And so I do think that as much as we'd like to distance her from kind of gendered understandings of what it means to be a quote unquote woman, I do think that she was operating in a world in which her gender was front and center. She could, when she went to Paris as an 18-year-old, she was very keenly aware of how she was being positioned because of her own beauty as this bright new thing, this kind of new toy that the art world in Paris could play with. So I think she did live within this very gendered reality. But I think that, yeah, her work is able to transcend a lot of the binary aspect of gender and maybe create something more expansive and inclusive.
Mm-hmm.
And then this is
not final.
This is the final section at the Addison, but not the final section at the Gray. This is a group of works that we've kind of grouped together under the title "The Two Sensibilities Walk Linked," which looks not just at romantic relationships, but really at dynamics between two beings or more than two beings in some cases. But this is also where you get a lot of the sort of more explicitly autobiographical work, or the most explicitly autobiographical work, at least about her adult life and relationship with Robert Frank. And you have a lot of work here about the dynamics at play between two artists. The painting that you see on the right of these two figures on these kind of stilt horses with almost jousts. Though that's called the painters. So there is this really interesting acknowledgement of the complexities of two artists cohabitating, and great works that again that she oscillates between the very specific and the the more general and universal. There's a great piece called Sisters, which is a two-headed snake attacking itself. Which again, if you want to go into Freudian analysis, I think there's a lot there. So there's, it's all about the complexities of beings sharing space, and its glory and then horrors. And then the final section at the Gray is called Climbing Still. And there's this great quote that we begin the show with about June sort of being wound up like a top and then set out, boom, pow, into the world. And that's really, she had this sort of like a Sisyphusian quality to her where she went to the studio and worked and worked and worked every day. And so it was this perpetual act of getting up and working and trying and creating and then going to bed, waking up, creating. And so that she was always ascending, always moving towards something. There isn't, and part of the reason why, I mean, this show didn't lend itself to a chronological installation is that there is no end point. It's she's always kind of creating works about beings that are in states of becoming, and this is a section that really looks at this idea of being perpetually in motion. So you have figures ascending staircases, ladders, this kind of spiral. You have this sense of her interest in the body and the body in motion, tied going way back to her interest in dance. But then you also have these works that speak to the creative process as well, this relentless, restless urge to continue to create. And she was creating really up until the end of her life. She was using blowtorches and power tools right up to the end, which I think we should all be so lucky.
I only went to her studio a couple of times over the years, but somehow the impression I seem to bring from those is her almost looking at her materials and looking at her work with a kind of skepticism. It's almost as if she was observing what she had made with the same kind of vision that she observed how other people behaved out in the world. It was sort of, these things were semi-independent of her.
Completely.
And she could eye them a bit suspiciously.
Yeah.
And she talks about them talking back to her.
Yeah.
That it is sort of out of her control. She might start that ball rolling, but they tell her what to do and when to do it.
And she, again, this sense of, they're hard to apply this chronology. There were works that she began in the 50s, paintings that she continued to work on almost to the end of her life. She, I think, had knowing when to stop was a little bit difficult. And I think, releasing work out into the world was not the easiest thing necessarily, because she had these deep attachments to these works. And you would often, visit the studio and then a figure would be moved from a painting to a sculpture. And again, just speaking to the facility with which she moved between media and how one medium informed another. The drawings informed the sculpture. She sculpted in order to better understand painting. She painted in order to understand sculpture. So this total creative practice that was so all-encompassing. And she was this incredible mad scientist. If you go to her, her studio, it was like stepping into Dr. Frankenstein's lair. I mean, it was remarkable, with all of these bits of metal strewn everywhere and paintings that were in various states of creation. So it was this amazing laboratory that she worked in.
And I think I don't really know other painters in particular who seem so kind of hands-on with the physical matter of the painting. And it's funny that you said it's like Frankenstein's laboratory, because yes, the paintings to me could be sort of like Frankenstein's monsters, because it seemed like she had painted them and maybe cut them down and then added something, sewn on a whole rectangle extra here that she then added. And so there was never the sense that the boundaries were set.
No, everything was sort of in a state of flux. And again, this tension where she's always pushing up against the boundaries of what's feasible and possible. For her, if she didn't like the way that a composition worked, she would, you can see in a number of works, just sew more a panel of canvas or rip things up and again, layer them on top of each other. So there wasn't this preciousness also about the work. The work was living, breathing, and was subject to change. And so, dating some of this work is tricky because there were certain things that she started years before and then would make, would make some sort of amendment to much later on. But, that this practice was so expansive and was, not limited to she was not producing work with the sole mission of selling work or making deadlines for shows. That there was this really just honest, creative practice that again was pretty inspiring and remarkable.
There's a thing. Oh, sorry. There was a thing because I feel like we're kind of coming toward our time here, and there was a thing I had wanted to ask about if we're maybe more or less through with our tour of the show, which is just to step back for a minute and ask how the show came about and how long you'd all been working with June and how that happened, how it was initiated.
It was probably about 5 years in the making. And actually, Jock Reynolds, who's prior Addison director and was here when June's first show was presented, just threw out the idea that there should be a full retrospective, and would the Addison be interested in doing such a thing? And we, of course, leapt at that. Then met with June, connected with the Allen Memorial Art Museum. Together, we visited her. At that point, Andrea Glimscher and Carrie Asenzo, Andrea of Hyphen and Carrie also of Hyphen, met with us, and we just started meeting with June, making visits to the studio, trying to figure out how exactly we would structure it to put the best, most comprehensive picture of June's extremely varied work forward. So it was all that's to say, it was a huge team effort. And the three of us feel so honored to have had all that support.
And the artist Suzanne Helmuth, who's also married to Jock Reynolds,
Yes.
is an Oberlin alum who's on our advisory committee. And so she began the conversation with us in 2011 about doing this exhibition.
That's how yeah.
And also Alan Frumpkin, who was a longtime supporter of June's work and hosted her first exhibition, solo exhibition, was also a longtime supporter of the Allen. It was also he was the inaugural member of our advisory board at Oberlin. So the Allen has this this kind of strong tradition of supporting women artists, from Ava Hesse, whose archive we hold, to Mary Miss and Judith Reigel. So this felt like part of our ethos also.
It was destiny. There were lots of connections.
Thank you all so much. First of all, this has been an absolute pleasure to listen to. Thank you for walking us through the exhibition, and thank you, Barry, for your questions. Thank you, Allison, Gordon, and Sam. We have many audience questions already. I will try to get through as many as possible. If you have a question, feel free to post it in the chat, and I'll try to get to you when I can. The first question is going to come from Joe Fife. Joe, I'll give you the chance to unmute if you would like to. There you go.
Thank you. Well, I wanted to answer a question first. I've been up to Cape Breton once or twice. One of the artists there told me that the first New York artist to be up there was Jeff Hendricks, the Fluxus artist. I don't know the dates exactly, so I don't know whether Robert and June came up during the same time or later, or they heard it from him, but this is what I heard from another artist. And I noticed there's a piece that Hendrix did in Cape Breton in 73 when I did a quick look. The one other thing I actually wanted to mention was I think that the term carnivalesque in relation to the first part of the exhibition, I think carnivalness probably would have been better, because I think carnivalesque refers to her entire output, which I don't want to sound too pedantic, but according to Bakhtin, the carnivalesque is actually always contrary to the status quo and always demands new and unchanging forms. And the thing that I particularly appreciate and always have about June Leaf is the way that she always challenged existing forms, almost quite deliberately, was making, let's not say unfriendly work, but I always think of it as having a little bit of the beatnik ethos of being sort of, unappetizing on top with all the skill and learning and technique underneath. And you better be good to get past that.
I'm really glad you mentioned the word beatnik, because I always thought of her as being a kind of one of the last of the beat generation. Somehow she had that air about her. And you also just gave me a very good idea that we can coin a new word. On the model of carnality, we can have carnivality.
Carnivality. Carnivality. Okay, well, that's enough for me. Thank you very much. This is great.
Thank you, Joe, for that question and for your comments there. Our next question is from an anonymous audience member who asks, why do you think this is a moment when several Chicago women artists near June's generation are finally receiving international attention? I'm thinking of Diane Simpson, Evelyn Statzinger, Miyoko Ito, Sue Ellen Roca, and others.
When Diane Simpson had her 2015 exhibition at the ICA Boston, I was working there, and she gave a talk, and she said, I don't know why all these young artists are interested in my work now. I guess it's the craft. And I really think that that is so apt for a number of these artists. It's the craftsmanship that is like, it's like returned from like hyper glossy, really heavily manufactured art to these artists whose craft was so impeccable, and they were so committed to doing everything with their hands. So that could be one aspect of an answer to that question.
And I don't think it's just Chicago artists. I think that we're seeing a time where there's been an incredible effort to reconsider and reevaluate all sorts of artists who were overlooked, because they were women, because they were people of color, because they were both, because of lots of reasons. And it's just totally reinvigorated our sense of what the last, let's say 80 years of American art, since, let's say, the post-World War II period, have been. And it's still very much up for grabs and up in the air. It's kind of exciting.
Thank you, Barry. Thank you for that question, audience member. Daniel Schulman asked the next question. Daniel, would you like to unmute to ask directly? Okay.
I'd be happy to. Yeah, thanks. I'm busting that somebody mentioned Evelyn Statzinger. I'm the director of Evelyn's foundation. So I'm so excited about this interest in Chicago artists, generally women artists from Chicago in the late 40s and early 50s. And my question was really about a striking relationship that June must have had with Seymour Rozovsky, who's the artist above my shoulder here. They were almost interchangeable in terms of style, and the way that they continued beyond their relationship, about which I know very little, and also the impact of one on the other obviously goes back and forth and is unresolved to my knowledge. And your mention of June and toys and nostalgia and childhood, as well as the rawness of Chicago, I think all those things resonate so strongly. So anyway, thank you so much. I saw the show at the Addison. It was just the most wonderful experience. So thank you and congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. An audience member would like to know if June Leaf was interested in or influenced by Alexander Calder's sculptures.
That's really interesting. I think that was not something that, at least to my knowledge, she didn't explicitly talk about the circus. I mean, I see the circus as being very much sort of a spiritual compatriot with a lot of what June did. She was interesting in the way that she would reveal her references or her inspirations. I think in terms of sculpture, Giacometti was someone who she would very freely discuss as being a point of influence. But in terms of sculptors like Calder, she really only credited Germaine Richier, a French artist who did these sort of wild humanoid insect sculptures, as being one of the other artists, vaguely a contemporary, that she was really inspired by. But I do see a very clear sort of connection, even if it's not explicit, between Calder's work and June's work, especially the kinetic component. But influence is a tricky thing to pin down with June. She revealed certain aspects of her influence. I mean, Mark Tobey was a big influence. Paul Klee was an influence. People like Ensor, the people that the Chicago Imagists were really looking at, and very deliberate opposition to the artists that people in New York were looking at. So she, again, really interested in those artists who retained or utilized the figure as a major component in their work.
Thank you, Gordon, and thank you for that question. I'll end with this really sweet comment from Margaret in the audience. Margaret says, many years ago, I met June Leaf in front of what was then the Mabou General Store. She was very critical of some of the New York City theater artists who came to Cape Breton Island. She said they treated Cape Breton natives as amusing local color, and in some of their productions, the artists mimicked the local Scottish Gaelic inflected accents. Her own commitment to Cape Breton and her humility about and respect for Cape Breton people was striking. June, may flights of angels fly thee to rest.
That's so beautiful. Just at the memorial service in Canada, it was in the space where June actually took violin lessons, because there was this big boom of interesting Celtic music in Canada, and she got right into it. She always wanted, she always fancied herself a dancer and musician. But she was just so embedded, and she was so aware of the complex dynamics of power that come when people from away come into these communities, and did not want to repeat that. So that comment really speaks to that beautifully.
Well, thank you all so much for that Q&A, and thank you, audience members, for all of your really thoughtful questions. We're going to conclude today with a video. Before I share it, do you want to introduce it to us a little bit and tell us what it is?
This is a video from Roman Chalupnik. We sifted through millions of pieces of video, full-form videos, trying to decide what we might want to include in the show. And then we stumbled on this. Roman is from Belgium, and he was a fan of June's and came to visit her. I think it was in 2019. And this was made over the course of 2 days. And it's just a lovely snapshot of June at work. There are a lot of works in the video that are included in the show, so you'll see them in process. And we just thought it was a beautiful way to bring June's life force into the exhibition.
Thank
and
you.
That's all I'm going to say.
The video is 7 minutes long. I'm going to play it now for everybody.
I think visual language, it's not the same as sound language or word language. It's all intuition. When I make something, there is a road that takes me to the solution. There's a road, and I don't know the road. You just work until you get to that feeling where it gets off the ground by itself. It has its own life, and I am merely a servant of that process. There you are, that's better. That's better. Sometimes it comes all of a sudden. The whole piece comes alive all of a sudden, very rare. That's a wonderful moment. Most of the time, you have to do whatever that end result wants you to do. So I just keep working and working, and as I'm working, something says, no, that's the wrong road. No, that's the wrong road. No, that's the wrong road. I have a painting I still work on from 1955. And I could take it out now and I could work on it. You are working for this phenomenon. You are working for it. This summer I will be 90. So if you've been an artist for 70 years, which is maybe it's more than that, it's a wonderful thing to be able to hear the voice that tells you that's the wrong road. Because I think if a visual artist has the good luck to live so long, he starts to understand the things that he knew when he was a child. And I'm very lucky that I still have that child awake in me. That same child from when I'm 3.5, 4 years old. That is one of the greatest gifts a painter can have. Because the age I was when I realized, that's like the same age I am now, in a way, the way I was thinking. I was 3.5 or so, and I had a very good relationship with my mother. That is, I loved her very much. We were very good together. But I remember that I was with her and I realized that I was going to make things with my hands all my life. I just knew it, and I said, oh, today is the day I will begin. What shall I make? Oh, I think I will make my mother's shoes. I love her shoes. How do you make a shoe? So I thought, I'll go ask her. When I looked at her, I thought, but maybe my mother doesn't care about how you draw a shoe. Well, I'll find out. So I said, Mother, draw me a shoe. There it is, there it is. I could see she didn't want to draw me a shoe. So she drew it and it was wrong. And I looked at it and I was polite. I didn't say, no, 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 that's wrong. I thought, no, 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 that's wrong. And that was the second awakening. So I drew the shoe. And then I thought, I'm not ever going to tell my mother what I'm going to do with my life. Because if I tell her, she's so different from me that she will try to change my mind. And I don't want her to change my mind. So I will never tell her. And I kept that secret from her till I was 16 years old, or 17 when I went away to school. And she reacted just in the same way that that child knew she would react. No, 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 that's not for you. No, no, no. I mean, it's the way I watched her. She doesn't want to draw the shoe. She doesn't care how you draw a shoe. And to me, to draw a shoe, it was holy. It was just, it was holy. And I resolved never to tell her. Because children can think very well. Maybe when the language is formed, they learn language, they learn to think. So my thoughts were very intelligent and very perceptive, more perceptive than an adult, because I was very observant of people, how they are, The child I was is the child I am now. And now I understand the things I knew when I was a child. I'm the same person. It's so lucky to live this long. But then, that's the life in the studio. And maybe the bigger problems are when you leave the studio and you have to face the world. That's always very challenging. The life with others, And I think without that, this would have no value.
Thank you so much again, Allison, Gordon, Sam, and Barry, for today's program and conversation. It's been such a pleasure. I would like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring the New Social Environment program and making daily conversations like this possible. We're also sponsored by the Tiger Foundation. And they also support our archive, which you can view on the Rails YouTube channel. The Rail has been free and independent for 25 years this October. A donation directly supports us, our writers, our staff, and our operations. You can support our work through the link in the chat. And if you're free on Monday at 1 p.m., join us for a conversation with artist Monira Al-Qadiri, hosted by Mortaza Vali on the occasion of Cosmic Machine at Perotin and First Sun on View, curated by Public Art Fund here in New York. And as is a Rail tradition, you all can now turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you so, so much for joining us today, everyone, and take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. This has been wonderful.
Thank you.
Wonderfully done.
Great.
Much appreciated.
So much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everybody. Thank you,
Goodbye.
Allison.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.